It starts with a sound like a giant vacuum cleaner, a high-pitched mechanical whine tearing through the humidity. Then, a silence as the ordnance falls. Finally, a deep, pressurized whoosh that sucks the air out of your lungs. This isn't the sharp crack of high explosives. It is a rolling wall of orange heat that flows like water and burns at 2,000 degrees. It incinerates the vegetation, melts metal, and suffocates men hiding in bunkers 50 meters away. The North Vietnamese army called it the firestorm, and they learned to fear the specific silhouette of the silver jet that delivered it. By 1965, the North Vietnamese army had solved the problem of American firepower. They knew they could not survive a B-52 arc-light strike or a heavy artillery barrage, so they negated the advantage. They developed a tactic called grabbing the belt buckle. The doctrine was simple. Get so close to the Americans that you could read the name tapes on their fatigues. If the NVA were within 30 meters of the U.S. perimeter, the American commanders could not call in artillery without shredding their own men. In the thick canopy of the Central Highlands and the Mekong Delta, entire battalions of American infantry found themselves pinned down, unable to maneuver, staring at muzzle flashes from bunkers that were invisible until they were 5 feet away. The Americans needed air support that could operate inside that 30-meter margin of error, but the tools they had were wrong for the job. The McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom was the pride of the Air Force. It was a technological marvel, designed to fly at twice the speed of sound and shoot down MiGs with radar-guided missiles. But in a close-range jungle fight, speed was a liability. The Phantom was a fast mover. By the time a Phantom pilot spotted the purple smoke marking the enemy position, he was already past it. He had to circle back, burning fuel and time, while men on the ground died. Worse, standard high-explosive bombs were failing. In War Zone C, pilots dropped 500-pound bombs on NVA bunker complexes. The bombs would hit the triple canopy jungle, detonate in the trees, and rain shrapnel harmlessly downward. The NVA stayed safe in their log-reinforced bunkers, waited for the noise to stop, and kept shooting. The infantry didn't need a scalpel, and they didn't need a sledgehammer. They needed something that could flow like water. They needed a weapon that could splash over a bunker complex, pour into the firing slits, and suck the oxygen out of the tunnels. They needed napalm, and they needed a delivery truck slow enough to drop it right on the belt buckle. Colonel Jack Broughton was a fighter pilot's pilot, a man who lived for air-to-air combat. But he watched as the mission profile changed. He described the shift from the glamour of dogfighting to the grit of close air support. It wasn't about being an ace anymore. It was about being a truck driver. The infantry needed a pilot who could haul heavy loads of jellied gasoline, come in at treetop level, and loiter in the target area until the job was done. The solution wasn't the newest jet in the inventory. It was an aging, finicky silver sledgehammer that had been designed for a completely different war. The North American F-100 Super Sabre was never meant to hunt gorillas in a jungle. When it rolled off the assembly lines in the 1950s, it was built for one purpose: a high-speed nuclear dash across Europe. It was the first operational fighter capable of breaking the sound barrier in level flight. North American Aviation, the same company that built the legendary P-51 Mustang and the F-86 Sabre, designed the Hun to fly fast, drop a nuclear weapon on a Soviet airfield, and get out. But by the mid-60s, the nuclear mission in Europe was being taken over by missiles. The F-100 was becoming obsolete. Then the Air Force looked at its hardpoints. The F-100 was built like a brute. It had 4 20mm M39 cannons in the nose, guns that could shred a truck column in seconds. More importantly, it had wings strong enough to carry 7,000 pounds of ordnance. It didn't have the sophisticated bombing computers of the modern jets. It was an eyeball airplane. The pilot aimed by looking through a simple gun sight and feeling the aircraft. To the engineers at North American, the F-100 was a supersonic interceptor. To the tactical planners in Vietnam, it was the perfect mule for the BLU-27/B napalm canister. The BLU-27 was a silver cylinder filled with roughly 100 gallons of polystyrene, benzene, and gasoline. It wasn't a precision instrument, it was a terror weapon. When dropped, it didn't explode outward. It tumbled, split open, and splashed forward in a rolling wall of heat that burned at over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. But turning a supersonic nuclear bomber into a low-level grunt escort came with a deadly price. The F-100 had a swept-wing design meant for high speed. At low speeds, the kind required to line up a napalm run in a narrow valley, the wings lost lift in terrifying ways. If a pilot pulled the nose up too hard while flying slow, the airflow over the wings separated. The jet would pitch up violently, stall, and roll over on its back. The pilots called it the Sabre Dance. At altitude, you could recover. At 200 feet above the jungle canopy, the Sabre Dance was a death sentence. Then there was the heat. The F-100's cockpit was tiny, wrapped around a massive Pratt & Whitney J57 turbojet engine. In the tropical humidity of South Vietnam, the cockpit turned into a sauna. It was so hot that pilots frequently taxied to the runway with the canopy open just to keep from passing out before takeoff. They sat on top of an ejection seat that sometimes didn't work, inside an airframe that wanted to stall at low speeds, carrying 2,000 pounds of liquid fire under their wings. It was a dangerous, uncomfortable, unforgiving aircraft. But when the troops on the ground heard the distinct, cracking roar of the J-57's afterburner, they didn't care about the aerodynamics. They knew the Hun was coming to burn the jungle down. By May of 1968, the F-100 had found its true calling. It wasn't fighting MiGs over Hanoi. It was saving lives in the mud of Bien Hoa and Long Binh. But its most precise, most desperate test came at a fire support base named Corral, 25 miles northeast of Saigon. The 1st Australian Task Force had established the base right across the infiltration routes of the NVA 7th Division. The North Vietnamese didn't just probe the perimeter, they launched a regimental-sized human wave attack. On the night of May 16th, the Australian lines were buckling. The NVA were inside the wire, overrunning the mortar pits of the 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment. The diggers were fighting hand-to-hand in the weapon pits. The forward air controller, Warrant Officer Blue O'Reilly, was in a bird dog circling overhead. He looked down at the chaos. The enemy and the Australians were mixed together in a confused brawl. Standard doctrine said you couldn't drop heavy ordnance within 200 meters of friendly troops. O'Reilly knew that if he followed doctrine, the base would fall. He called for the Huns. F-100s from the 35th Tactical Fighter Wing at Phan Rang answered the call. They came in under the light of swaying parachute flares, their silver skins reflecting the eerie artificial daylight. Corporal Bob Hyslop of the 1st RAR was in a pit on the perimeter, watching the NVA mass for another charge. He heard the distinctive howl of the intake, a sound like a giant vacuum cleaner, followed by the earth-shaking crack of the afterburner. The pilots couldn't see the individual soldiers. They were relying entirely on O'Reilly's voice. He talked them down to the deck. The F-100s leveled off at treetop height, flying so low that the pilots were looking up at the flare parachutes. They released the napalm. The canisters tumbled end over end, glistening in the flare light, and struck the earth less than 50 meters from the Australian positions. The ignition was instant. A wall of orange fire erupted between the Australians and the NVA. It didn't explode. It rolled. The gelatinous fuel splashed forward, incinerating the charging enemy instantly. Inside the Australian pits, the heat was so intense it singed the hair on the men's arms and dried the sweat on their faces. It worked because of the F-100's stability at low altitude when heavy. The lead sled was stable as a rock in the groove. The pilots could put the canisters exactly where O'Reilly asked, creating a literal firewall that the NVA could not cross. While the single-seaters were building walls of fire in the south, a different breed of F-100 pilot was hunting in the north. They were the Misty FACs, forward air controllers flying the two-seat F-100F. Major George Bud Day, the commander of the unit, knew that finding the enemy on the Ho Chi Minh Trail required a different kind of courage. You couldn't spot a camouflage truck from 10,000 feet at 600 knots. You had to get down in the weeds. Day and the other Misty pilots flew constant, erratic turns, jinking, to spoil the aim of the anti-aircraft gunners. They weren't just marking targets, they were trolling for fire. They would dive the F-100F toward a suspected gun position, waiting for the muzzle flashes to reveal the enemy. It was a mission that required the pilot to constantly wrestle the heavy controls of the Super Sabre, pulling 4 or 5 Gs for hours at a time, sweat stinging his eyes, scanning the jungle for the geometric shape of a truck or a bunker. When they found it, they didn't just call it in. They often rolled in themselves, firing marking rockets to guide the heavy bombers. Bud Day called the F-100 an honest airplane. It didn't have computers to fly it for you. If you were good, it put the ordnance on the target. If you weren't, it killed you. And sometimes, even when you were good, the fog of war turned the weapon against your own men. The precision at Coral was the F-100's triumph, but the horror of the weapon is forever linked to a rubber plantation in Phuoc Tuy province during a mission called Operation Abilene. It was April 11, 1966. Charlie Company, 2nd Battalion, 16th Infantry of the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, was walking into a trap. The company, commanded by Captain William Meyer, was moving through the dense Cam Mai woods. The canopy was triple-layer thick, blocking out the sun. The undergrowth was a tangle of vines and wait-a-minute bushes. Visibility was less than 5 meters. Without warning, the jungle erupted. A reinforced Viet Cong battalion, numbering over 400 men, opened fire from 3 sides. The Americans hit the dirt, but there was no cover. The VC were in fortified bunkers, firing heavy machine guns down pre-cut lanes. Within minutes, the American perimeter began to collapse. Casualties mounted. The radio waves were a scream of chaos. Broken Arrow, the code for a unit being overrun, went out over the net. The forward air controller arrived overhead in his O-1 Bird Dog. He looked down at the sea of green canopy. He couldn't see the muzzle flashes. He couldn't see the Americans. He could only see the smoke grenade Captain Meyer popped to mark the center of his shrinking perimeter. The F-100s from the 3rd Tactical Fighter Wing checked in. They were carrying Snake and Nape, high-drag bombs, and napalm. The FAC made a decision. He couldn't see the enemy, but he knew they were closing in. He ordered the F-100s to drop on the edge of the smoke. It was a gamble. In the humid, stagnant air under the canopy, smoke drifts. It doesn't rise straight up. The lead F-100 pilot rolled in. He aligned his sights on the drifting wisp of colored smoke. He was flying at 300 knots, staring through a piece of glass, trying to estimate the drift. He pressed the release button on the stick. 2 silver canisters detached from the wing pylons. Specialist 4th Class Jack Smith was a machine gunner with Charlie Company. He was already wounded, lying in the mud, firing his M60 until the barrel glowed white-hot. The noise was deafening. AK-47s, M16s, grenades, and the screams of the wounded. Then, he heard the sound that every infantryman prays for, the roar of a jet engine. He looked up through a break in the leaves. The canisters tumbled through the trees, snapping branches as they fell. They didn't hit the VC perimeter. They hit the center of Charlie Company's command group. The jungle turned orange. Napalm doesn't detonate with a sharp crack like high explosives. It makes a deep, pressurized whoosh, like a gas oven igniting in a small room. The canisters split open on impact, spraying jellied gasoline in a wide, fan-shaped arc. Jack Smith described the moment the world ended. "The heat was so intense I couldn't breathe," he later said. "The air was sucked out of my lungs. The boy next to me was screaming, 'God, somebody help me!' I looked and he was on fire. Liquid fire." The napalm clung to everything it touched: uniforms, skin, rifles, radio sets. It burned at 2,000 degrees, but the fire wasn't the only killer. The combustion was so rapid and so massive that it consumed all the oxygen in the immediate area. Men who weren't touched by a single drop of the gel suffocated where they lay, gasping for air that wasn't there. Sergeant James Robinson, who would later be awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions that day, was burned over much of his body. Despite the agony, he continued to move among the men, dragging the wounded away from the flames, propping them up, giving them water. He fought on until he was mortally wounded by a sniper. The tragedy at Za Kham. Mai wasn't malice. It was the brutal mathematics of the F-100. It was a weapon of mass destruction being used as a precision instrument. The pilot had done exactly what he was trained to do. He hit his mark, but the mark was wrong. The disaster at Abilene exposed the terrifying limitation of the F-100 in Vietnam. It was a dumb system. There were no laser designators, no GPS coordinates, no smart bombs. The entire kill chain relied on a pilot's eyes, a grease pencil mark on a map, and a cloud of colored smoke. If a pilot flinched, if the wind shifted, if the smoke drifted, men died. Captain Don Kilgus, who flew F-100s with the 416th, knew the cost intimately. He wasn't dropping bombs from 30,000 feet like the B-52 crews. He was down in the mud. You could smell the napalm in the cockpit, Kilgus recalled. If you were low enough, and we were always low enough, the heat wave would bump the aircraft. It was a physical punch from the ground. That punch was the air rushing back into the vacuum created by the fire. It was a reminder that they were close enough to kill, and close enough to see the results. There is a myth that pilots were detached from the war, sanitized by altitude and speed. For the F-100 drivers, that was a lie. They saw the tracers reaching for them. They saw the bunkers explode, and sometimes they saw the desperate wave of an American soldier trying to tell them they were aiming too close. The physical toll on the pilots was immense. They flew 2, sometimes 3 sorties a day. They wrestled a heavy, non-hydraulic stick that made their arms cramp. They sat in 120-degree cockpits, soaked in sweat, breathing pure oxygen that dried out their lungs. And they lived with the constant, gnawing fear that the next canister might tumble into the wrong trench. The enemy adapted too. After the walls of fire at Corral and Khe Sanh, the NVA refined their belt-buckle tactics. They dug deeper. They built bunkers with sharp turns to stop the flow of the liquid fire, but they never lost their fear of the silver jet. To the NVA, the F-100 wasn't a machine. It was a dragon that breathed fire. The F-100 Super Sabre didn't stay in the fight until the end. By 1971, the last F-100 units packed up and went home. The Air Force wanted newer, faster jets with better radars and computers. But the lesson of the Hun remained. The Air Force realized that for close air support, speed was the enemy. They needed a plane that could fly low, turn tight, and carry a massive load of ordnance. They needed a plane that could survive ground fire. The direct descendant of the F-100's mission in Vietnam is the A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog. The A-10 was built to do exactly what the F-100 did by accident, get down in the weeds and brawl with the infantry. For the men who served, the memory of the F-100 isn't about aerodynamics or development history. It is sensory. It is the smell of benzene and burning wood. It is the sight of a silver wing flashing over the canopy. Major Bud Day, who survived being shot down and endured years as a POW, always defended the old jet. "It was an honest airplane," he said. "It didn't lie to you." And for the veterans of the 1st Australian Task Force, the memory is a sound. The specific, mechanical scream of the compressor, followed by the silence of the release. The F-100 was a paradox. It was a savior that built walls of fire to protect the living. And it was a horror that delivered liquid death to friends and enemies alike. It was the silver jet that pulled up hard against the green jungle, leaving behind a scar on the earth that would never heal. And for the men who were under that canopy, looking up, the Super Sabre remains the defining nightmare and the defining salvation of the Vietnam War.